Hi class. I've asked you to take a look at chapter 19 here. I'm going to review some of that material fairly briefly. Make sure that you've read through it. We're going to talk about the COVID-19 pandemic and the virus that's responsible for causing this pandemic, SARS-CoVID-2. We also need to remember that while the virus is biological and the impact that it has upon our bodies and its emergence from nature does have a biological component, this is also very cultural. In other words, our behavior, our beliefs have led to the spread of SARS-CoV in ways that a lot of countries didn't expect it would. So let's take a look at the SARS-CoV-2 virus, how it emerged, and the role that humans have played in spreading disease. Let's move to the next slide. So here, let's take a look at SARS-CoV-2. In contrast to the conspiracy theorists out there, for example, some individuals have tried to implicate Bill Gates in the COVID-19 pandemic because he predicted a pandemic some 5 years ago. And at the outset, I want to state that a number of people, including myself, have predicted the outbreak of another pandemic or the occurrence of another pandemic. For example, in my graduate work back in 2000, I said it wasn't a matter of if there will be another outbreak of disease, but rather when. And I argued that the age of epidemic infectious disease has certainly not come to an end. So here we want to take a look at the facts, we want to take a look at the science, and let's start out with the virus. So SARS-CoV-2, it belongs to the coronavirus family, and these are fairly large viruses. A lot of them are responsible for the common cold. For example, as pointed out in our textbook, page 231, I note that the 1800s saw an outbreak of disease that was responsible for the death of some 1 million individuals, and this is attributed to the human coronavirus OC43. Today, that virus causes the common cold, or it's one of the viruses that cause the common cold. So a number of coronaviruses do or are responsible for the common cold, and we're hoping that eventually the virulence or the strain and how deadly it is or how powerful it is, it will change over time and it'll be similar to the common cold. But only time will tell. So here we need to nonetheless proceed with caution. So as pointed out, many older coronaviruses, they cause the common cold today, but at one point of time they were in fact novel and they did have a profound impact on populations. SARS-CoV-2, as pointed out, it's a large virus, and in fact, it's what we refer to as a RNA virus or a ribonucleic acid virus. And the interesting thing about it is it has this proofreading mechanism that prevents it from weakening over time, and this poses some problems to research in an attempt to develop a vaccine or a way to effectively deal with the virus through medication. The other thing about the COVID-2 virus is it has the ability to swap genes with other coronaviruses. This is a process that we've talked about already called recombination. In other words, if it infects, for example, minks like it has in the United States and in Holland, for example, if those minks are carrying other coronaviruses, it could swap out some of that material. It could pick up something that could cause it to be deadlier or perhaps weaker. Let's move to the next slide. So here we see an individual sneezing, and in that sneeze we have respiratory droplets, and if they are infected with SARS-CoV-2, inside of those respiratory droplets, we're going to find that SARS-CoV-2 virus. So this is one of the ways within which the virus is transmitted through airborne transmission. We've looked at that in our readings, and also potentially vehicle-borne as well. And this is why it's so important that individuals wear a mask, not only to protect themselves from this potential situation, but also protect others if we are infected. And we know that a number of individuals don't show symptoms. In other words, they're asymptomatic. If this individual individual sneezes on a surface, this is why hand washing is so important, that we keep our hands clean so we don't engage in a type of transmission where we get it on our fingers and then we pick our nose. We shouldn't pick our nose. That's terribly embarrassing if somebody sees us. But either way, it's a great way to get that virus or those virons inside of your nose, and that's where they tend to reproduce. So SARS, right now we know that it's through airborne transmission, vehicle-borne transmission, and there has been some research that suggests that this can also be transmitted sexually through semen. The other thing is, even if an individual isn't sneezing around us, this virus can be suspended in the air for hours, approximately 3 hours. Now, the viral titer, it reduces over time. So if an individual sneezes immediately and leaves, and then you walk into that space within 10-20 minutes, the viral load will be high. Over hours, it will reduce. We also know that on a surface, depending upon the type of surface, it can live for up to 7 to 48 hours. So on stainless steel, it tends to live a long time. On cardboard, for example, it doesn't live a long time. You can see that stuff in your readings in chapter 19. Now, the other factor that we need to talk about here is the R0 factor, so the R0. That refers to how infectious a particular virus is. The R0 factor of SARS-CoVID-2, or the basic reproduction value, is about 5. Now, that's more infectious than Ebola. Ebola, for example, is about 1.5 to 1.9. In contrast, measles is about 15 to 18. Now, what that means is for every one person that's infected, in the case of measles, 18 people can potentially be infected with ease. The same thing can be said of SARS. With an R5 value, that means for every one individual, 5 people can be infected. And the other kind of worrisome thing about this is we just don't know enough about this virus at this point of time, and it can affect nearly every system in the human body. And in some situations, it causes an almost a hemorrhagic type of response where tissue starts to decay and you get internal bleeding. And in other situations, it's not that bad. An individual has a mild fever to a fairly significant fever and may be out for a number of days. Let's move to the next slide. Here I want to briefly talk about how the COVID-2 virus enters the body. And it does so through a receptor in our cells. It's called the ACE2 receptor. And if individuals are on particular medications for example, diabetes and high blood pressure, that can actually increase the ACE2 receptor susceptibility. So there's a number of different spikes, and the image on the top on the right, we can see that spike S protein, and it's that spike protein that attaches to this ACE2 receptor. And in doing so, the way I want you to think about this, and there's two ways we can think about it, as either a key and a lock. And imagine that our cells have these locks on them, and if you have the right type of key, then you can open it up just like a door and get into somebody's house or their body. Another way you can think about this is like a USB type of adapter. Now, in certain situations, for example, if we look at our USB adapter right here, there's no way that this adapter is going to plug into this old DIN receptor. Now, think about a virus that way. Some viruses and a lot of viruses that emerge, for example, in bat populations, in rat populations, mouse populations, they don't have that key to get into the human body. So imagine the human body here is like this DIN receptor, and the USB, it can't plug in. Now, if there's a mutation, and this is why evolutionary biology is so important to understanding disease. If there's a mutation, and think of an adapter that changes this particular USB connection in a manner that it can fit into this DIN receptor, then infection can occur. So that's the only way that this is taking place, is through mutation or recombination, where it's swapping genetic material and picking up the code that allows it to get into the body. So This type of change, either through recombination or mutation, ultimately it unlocks the cell's membrane and gains access to the body. And once the virus has gained access to the body, it releases its genetic code, in this case the RNA, and then it begins to replicate itself, and that's when infection and illness begins to occur. So, as pointed out, it's that mutation or recombination that's responsible for the ability of this virus to develop a key that can unlock the human cellular lock on our bodies like a door. And once it's done so, as pointed out, then infection can occur. I want to give you a couple of examples here. So HIV, we see the same type of thing. HIV, it enters the human body through something called a CCR5 receptor. And we know that at one point of time, we're not sure exactly when, some people suspect that the Black Death may have played a role in this. There was a mutation that changed that CCR5 receptor and produced what's referred to as CCR5 delta 32. Now, this mutation prevents individuals from becoming infected. In other words, it changes that key so the HIV virus can't plug its key into the body and open up that lock into the human body. And interestingly, 18% of Europeans are immune to HIV and don't develop AIDS as a result of this mutation. So as pointed out, is really important to understand at least the basics of evolution when we're looking at disease, to gain an understanding of some of the mechanisms that take place, and that helps us prepare for the future, develop vaccines or drugs, or even some situations with the case of HIV, they're currently working with T cells from rats and trying to splice that into human genetics because HIV doesn't affect rats. It doesn't have the right key. So they're thinking, let's change this receptor in some way that's perhaps similar to what's taken place naturally through natural selection with the CCR5 delta 32 mutation. Now you can read a little bit more about that stuff in your textbook, okay? Let's move to the next slide. As for the origins of COVID-2, it comes from a natural reservoir. Coronaviruses are studied. They're currently studied. We suspect that they do pose a problem or will continue to pose a problem for human populations. And bats are one of the areas that we focus on. They're a natural reservoir for this particular virus, the coronavirus. In the same way, if we looked at, for example, the Black Death. The Black Death, for example, is caused by a bacterium that we call Yersinia pestis. And the natural reservoir for Yersinia pestis is believed to be Asian marmots. And from there, it began to spread, eventually infected rats. And through rats, that's how it infected humans via that vector, the flea that I've asked you to read about. So the natural reservoir for COVID-2, it's been discovered in bats, specifically from the Yunnan caves. Now, in 2015, in China, there was some research in the Yunnan caves, and they collected a number of samples, and this particular sample that they have is referred to as RATG13. Apparently, at the Wuhan Institute for Virology, they documented this, they studied it back in 2015, and they shelved it. And it wasn't until recent times when we began to map the genome of the coronavirus that was infecting individuals in China that they went back to that RATG13 and said, let's compare it, looking for a relationship to see where this came from. Maybe it came from those bats. And what they found was the RATG13 sample of coronavirus, it's 96.3% genetically identical to the coronavirus that's spreading. What does that mean? Well, researchers think in all likelihood it's this particular bat population from the Yunnan caves that are responsible for this spillover event. Now, people speculate that it took about 25 to 65 years for it to change into the form that it is today. The other thing, and the bottom image on the right-hand side of the screen, we see a potential, or at least a suspected, intermediate species. So this is a species where the original CoViD-2, that RATG13 virus, may have infected a pangolin, or the scaly anteater. Looks a lot like Godzilla to me, which might be appropriate analogy, and I think we should fear bats for good reason, given all of this. Either way, the pangolin, or the scaly anteater, is suspected to be a potential intermediate species because of the way it's been used in the areas that this virus emerged in China, specifically in Wuhan, and associated with the wet markets there. The problem is the current intermediate species, the pangolins that they've studied, and they've looked at the virus in those particular species, they're only 86 to 91% homologous. In other words, that similarity to that virus is pretty low. So the thinking goes, if it did come from the scaly anteaters, the pangolins, it's not the ones that we've been currently studying. Some individuals suspected that it has come from perhaps snake populations, another foodstuff in China. And some individuals argued that perhaps it was just a direct spillover event from the natural reservoir without an intermediate species. And only time will tell at this stage. The World Health Organization, they're inquiring into the origins, the proximal origins, in an effort to understand how this began to move out from these bat populations and what the route was that was responsible for infecting humans. So there's potentially a recent spillover event in China, and this is a suspicion. It hasn't been illustrated as of yet, but because this is where we saw the first cases, people suspect that it's also going to be associated with some sort of behavior or cultural practice in China. Now let's take a look at that, because that helps us understand this concept that disease is just as much cultural as it is biological. Let's move on. Problematically, some individuals, when they look at the SARS-CoViD-2 virus, and they look at those mortality and morbidity patterns. So mortality, just review this concept here, and morbidity. When we refer to mortality, we're referring to the fatality. How many individuals die as a result of the virus. In contrast, morbidity refers to the incidence of disease. So how many individuals contract this? And what individuals have pointed out is we don't see the same mortality and morbidity rates in China, for example, as we see in the United States of America. And it's this type of thinking that have really led to conspiracy theories, and said, well, maybe China was responsible for manufacturing this particular virus as a type of biological warfare. We can't think that way. We have science, and we need to look at science. And science will help us understand why we see those differences in morbidity and mortality. So in reference to SARS-CoV-2, we know that there's a number of different strains. For example, there's an ancestral strain, and that's referred to as S. In contrast, fairly recently, a new strain was discovered, L, the L strain. Now, the S strain, go over here, the S strain, it's weaker. In contrast, the L strain, it's more virulent. In other words, it tends to cause more infection and much more serious infection. When individuals looked at the distribution of the S and the L strains in China, what they found is that 70% of the individuals that were infected with the S strain. In contrast, only 30% of the infections that had been recorded were caused by the L strain. So this tells us why we see a difference in those morbidity and mortality patterns, because in the United States of America and in Spain, what we're seeing here is a higher incidence of the L strain. All right, USA up there as an example. We're seeing a higher incidence of that L more virulent strain than what was present in China. So that helps us understand what's going on, the distribution of disease, and it allows us to move away from that conspiracy theory and draw on science. Now, this doesn't mean that science has all of the answers and our ideas won't change over time, but as individuals who are engaged in scholarly activity and trying to learn about disease, we're obligated to look at the science, and by definition, science is a work in progress. So we expect that it's going to change over time, and we may need to augment our ideas. But this is what we know about SARS-CoVID-2 right now and those infection differences that we've seen in China versus, for example, Spain and the United States. Let's move to the next slide. So when we look at the proximal origins of SARS-CoV-2, what we're interested in is the idea of where did this virus emerge, and where did that spillover event take place? So what we know currently, and these are suspicions, it emerged in China, and we have our first reports in December, late December, and it's been associated with the Wuhan, Hunan wet market. And one of the reasons, and here on the right-hand side of the screen, you're seeing a couple of images. There's a number of questionable food handling practices that go on there. Now, this doesn't mean that Canada doesn't have suspicious or problematic food handling practices. Just remember a number of years ago, there were cases of bovid encephalitis, that mad cow disease in Canada, and we had let infected cattle get into that food supply in the United States of America. They had discovered it. So again, we need to be careful when we're engaged in any of this finger pointing at individuals, because blame and understanding are two very different things. So as part of the cultural practice or the way that things are done in China, there's these wet markets. And the wet markets, they're called wet markets because they're just that. They're very wet places, and you have a mixture of different fluids. You have water, you have ice, you have blood, you have saliva, there's urine, there's feces, and that makes its way in here because not only do we have domestic animals that have gone through ideally a governmental inspection, but it's also a place where wild animals, land, sea, and air, and fruit as well, are sold. And some of that stuff is smuggled in there, and individuals are selling, for example, bottom picture we see the pangolin, animals that are on the black market. And they're highly sought after for their scales. They're believed to play a role in medicinal medicine. So it's in these types of situations where not only are you mixing different animals, but they're also slaughtering on site. And you don't have that ability to engage in that type of food inspection and proper handling that takes place. And these wet markets, if not properly regulated, they become a big petri dish for recombination and infection. I want to give you an example here. Before I go on to an example, I want to talk about another idea. So fairly early after the outbreak, Zhao and Zhao, they published a paper, and it was quickly retracted, which they implicated the Wuhan Institute for Virology. And they pointed out that there were a number of issues with safety there, and they thought that the virus, it wasn't created there, but it was accidentally released. Somebody was accidentally infected, and that's how it's made its way over into the Wuhan wet market, which is a few hundred meters away. Like I said, that was retracted. And interestingly, I think that's one of the things that Donald Trump has kind of zeroed in on, perhaps that retracted paper. Now, again, we don't know at this stage. So there may be another source. Some individuals have pointed out the one of the food eating practices that exists in China, for example, people eat bats. And we shouldn't be surprised. We shouldn't say, ooh, yuck. Well, that's not one of our foodstuffs, and people eat a variety of different things. For example, some people eat guinea pig, some people eat insects, some people, yes, eat bat, some people, they continue to eat cat, for example, some people eat dog and hold on to your socks, some people even eat McDonald's. Normally in class there'd be a laugh after that. Either way, we do have different dietary practices, and we shouldn't use that to create stigma and discriminate against other individuals. Food is food, and it might fit into our cultural preferences, and it might not. But the thing is, we do need to be careful because we do understand that viruses have emerged in very similar situations. In our next slide, I'll talk a little bit more about that. So let's move on. So looking at the idea of, or at least this from a biocultural perspective, we can ask, is China to blame or is everyone to blame? In other words, does all of our culture or any of our behaviors, has that played a role in the emergence of COVID-19 as a pandemic? And we need to be careful. We don't want to blame in the sense that we're creating stigma and we're engaging in racism and discrimination. As pointed out, I'm sure nobody in China wanted this to happen, certainly, but it did. So I want to read to you very briefly from the textbook, page 233. I point out, any review of epidemic or pandemic disease will reveal a fundamental truth. Disease is always blamed on someone else. From the Black Death to syphilis in the 1500s, AIDS, SARS, and H1N1, disease has always been placed squarely on the shoulders of the other, and the outbreak of SARS-CoViD-2 is no different. As pointed out, we don't want to engage in what Bryan Adams and Paul McCartney have done. They've created stigma, and their actions in calling Chinese individuals and people who engage in the wet market barbaric, that's racist. It doesn't mean that we can't look for the origins and place blame in a sense of where it emerged, but we don't want to create stigma. So there's a difference here between creating stigma and engaging in racism than developing an epidemiological and a cultural epidemiological understanding of the disease. Epidemiology is simply the study of the distribution of disease. Epidemiology, epi, disease, demos in Greek, populations, ology at the end, the study of. Cultural epidemiology is interested in how culture increases or prevents the distribution of disease. And our textbook, I've asked you to do a little bit of reading on Ebola, for example, so that cultural epidemiological approach, it underscored the role that Thibaut, love touches and love kisses played in spreading Ebola a few years ago. Now, this cultural epidemiological understanding, it's important because it helps us understand where disease emerges from, how cultural practices promote increased distribution. For example, in Malaysia, during the 1990s, there was kind of a boom in the farming markets as populations began to increase, and we almost have an overlap between pig farms and fruit farms and areas where there's a lot of bats. Now the bats, they come to eat the fruit, they excrete. Pigs come along, they eat some of the fruit that the bats have eaten, where we have saliva on that fruit, or they eat some of the excreta, the feces from the bats that's infected with viruses. And what began to emerge in the 1990s as a result of that kind of augmenting a natural ecosystem was the Nipah Valley fever. The same thing could be said of Ebola and HIV, which are both, as you know, because you've done the readings, they're associated with bushmeat. So these are cultural practices that can lead to the increased distribution, not even just the increased distribution, but those initial spillover events. Now, when it comes to blaming other people, Canada dropped the ball, as did most countries around the world. And what I mean by that is in 2004, following SARS, the outbreak of SARS, that epidemic that was localized in Toronto and surrounding areas, there was a paper, a number of papers written, but one in particular that I cite in chapter 19 by Lowe, and he really outlines the strategies that we need to adopt if we're going to prevent and successfully deal with another virus, if it goes pandemic or epidemic. And we didn't follow any of that advice that was written and was produced by the government of Canada. Further, people said, Tam, for example, she said, we shouldn't worry. This virus is in China. And if it does make its way to Canada, which is highly unlikely, we won't see many infections. Why would anybody say that? We understand that there's no controlling this, and China's literally just a number of hours away, and we have regular travel. So if something emerges there, it's going to make its way here, and we certainly didn't close down borders fast enough. We didn't have enough PPE, even though everybody said, as pointed out in our chapter, yeah, we have a very robust healthcare system. But when we started seeing cases here, we had to lock down because we didn't want to strain the healthcare system. Tents were erected, for example, in Burlington, outside of the hospital, in an attempt to deal with some of those cases. We didn't have enough PPE. Doctors and nurses all around the world were wearing garbage bags and other PPE that they had constructed because hospitals were running out. And I know really in April, kind of at the height of this in Canada, where we were really concerned, I have a nursing friend who was issued a mask, a surgical mask, and she was told that that's for the entire week. That's all we have. So we dropped the ball. So if there's somebody to blame for this becoming a problem here in Canada, and especially the United States, where they're seeing, I think as of today, probably 7 million cases, number one in the world, they've played a role in this as well, because no one heeded the advice of the experts. Doug Ford, for example, said, no, go on your March breaks, even though we had shut things down at that point of time. We knew better. But we didn't implement what we knew. We thought we were impervious. So the failure ultimately to adopt a sound strategy to deal with this virus, even though there was a lot of information out there, tons of it, and augment our behavior and our culture, it caused the spread of disease. And I want to point out that South Korea, the South Koreans, they didn't have the same morbidity nor mortality as Canada or the United States. Why? Because they locked down immediately. They regularly used PPE. They had a very rapid testing system that had already been developed that they implemented. And they also had a tracking app that they encouraged everybody to use. And because of those behaviors and that culture, in a country that's the size of pretty much Nova Scotia and as many people as Canada, they have 15,000 cases in around there. I also want to point out that we saw some very wacky ideas. Wade Davis, an anthropologist who writes an article in the Rolling Stone, he called Donald Trump a buffoon. Donald Trump suggested that people or the science community looks into how we could use bleach or disinfectants to cleanse our lungs. Now, this was serious. The CDC here, and we see an image on the right-hand side of the page, prevent the spread of COVID-19. Don't drink bleach or disinfectants. This can kill you. I think looking at that, what we also have to understand, it's in these types of periods of strife and confusion that conspiracy theories do emerge. A lot of confusion emerges. This happened during the plague of Thucydides, for example, during the Peloponnesian War. We'll talk a little bit about that. The Black Death saw confusion. It saw stigma. It saw conspiracy theories. This is par for the course. And it doesn't mean that we should ostracize these individuals. I think ultimately we need to approach it with understanding and try to help people make sense of what's good for all of us. If we want to get back to work, if we want to get back to school, if we want our economies going, there's a sacrifice. And as pointed out in the chapter, the villagers in Eyam, they did that. We need to do the same thing. And the faster that we adopt these programs and get with the basic plan here and the sound strategies, we're going to be able to start to bring this to an end, hopefully. And that's one of the reasons why I want to point out that wearing face masks is so important. If we begin to kind of bottleneck that virus, reduce the amount of people that are infected, it's almost a natural vaccination. And that's the idea of a vaccination is you begin to provide people with vaccines, and eventually everybody's vaccinated, and for example, virus in the case of smallpox in the late 1970s, it's finally eradicated. The problem with not wearing masks is so long as we're transmitting the virus from one person to the next, it always has a new host to infect, and it continues to survive. What we want to do is we want to prevent that virus from surviving, and the best way to do it is give it no one to infect. And if that happens, it's going to produce kind of in a natural way what a vaccine would do, and this disease, this virus, is not going to become endemic. It won't always have a fresh new host, and eventually it will disappear. So there's a number of approaches that we can take. Point is, this isn't just a biological thing. The disease, yes, SARS-CoViD-2 is biological. The pandemic, it's cultural. All right, we're going to leave it there. Take care.